A broken man saved a fierce woman no one wanted, and lost everything he thought mattered. But what they built together will shock you. What happens when two lost souls refuse to run? Emmett Rose buried his wife under the sycamore tree, after the land had long gone dry. The ground was hard, full of roots, just like his regrets. His wife died coughing blood, and with her, the last bit of sweetness in the house disappeared. They had no children, only prayers and hard soil. One by one the farms started dying. First the hens, then the well turned sour. Corn grew short. His hands turned bony. He was only 38, but moved like an old man. At night he'd lie in bed and listen to the silence, where her breath used to be, haunted by things he never said. When winter came, he sold everything but the bed. People in town whispered. Some pitied him, most avoided him. He became the man people looked through. Each morning brought more silence than sound, the kind that settled in the bones and stayed there. The sky seemed wider without her, but emptier too, like a roof torn off a hollow house. He kept a box of her things under the bed but never opened it, believing memory was stronger. Unopened, his fingers once strong and certain, now trembled when he held a cup, as if even tea had become too heavy. A letter arrived once. No name, no return address, just a single sentence. You still breathing? He never opened another envelope again. The house groaned at night like it too was grieving, floorboards sighing under the weight of ghosts and loneliness. One morning, he watched a storm roll in, and didn't move to cover the windows. Let it break, he thought. Let it take what's left. Emmett started speaking to the walls just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. The house groaned at night like it too was grieving, floorboards sighing under the weight of ghosts and loneliness. On the edge of sleep he thought he felt her hand on his back, cool and steady. It used to be when the fever broke. People in town said he was fading, and maybe he was bit by bit, memory by memory, like fog thinning at dawn. On the edge of sleep he thought he felt her hand on his back, cool and steady, like it used to be when the fever broke. One night, he lit every lamp in the house, and sat in silence, until dawn, just to see what the light might reveal. It showed only dust. Emmett started speaking to the walls just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. People in town said he was fading, and maybe he was bit by bit, memory by memory, like fog thinning at dawn. On the edge of sleep he thought he felt her hand on his back, cool and steady, like it used to be when the fever broke. A letter arrived once. No name, no return address, just a single sentence. You still breathing? He never opened another envelope again. He stopped going to town unless the pantry was bare, and even then, he walked slow like someone trying to outrun nothing. He stopped going to town unless the pantry was bare, and even then, he walked slow like someone trying to outrun nothing. The house groaned at night like it too was grieving, floorboards sighing under the weight of ghosts and loneliness. Each morning brought more silence than sound, the kind that settled in the bones and stayed there. Sometimes he spoke her name aloud, just to prove he hadn't forgotten how it sounded, but the name felt heavier now, like lead on his tongue. Each creak of the floor felt like a question he didn't want to answer. Each morning he woke unsure if he wanted to. He once found a sparrow caught in the chicken wire, and freed it gently, whispering apologies. It couldn't understand. He kept a box of her things under the bed but never opened it, believing memory was stronger. Unopened. His fingers, once strong and certain, now trembled when he held a cup, as if even tea had become too heavy. He once found a sparrow caught in the chicken wire, and freed it gently, whispering apologies. It couldn't understand. He once found a sparrow caught in the chicken wire, and freed it gently, whispering apologies. It couldn't understand. He sometimes imagined her standing in the kitchen again, humming something half forgotten, stirring a pot of something warm. He stayed because he didn't know where else to go, and he didn't leave because there was no one left to follow him. His fingers, once strong and certain, now trembled when he held a cup, as if even tea had become too heavy. He stopped going to town unless the pantry was bare, and even then, he walked slow like someone trying to outrun nothing. Sometimes he spoke her name aloud, just to prove he hadn't forgotten how it sounded, but the name felt heavier now, like lead on his tongue. Sometimes he spoke to the wind and called it by her name, just to feel foolish on purpose. There were days he forgot to eat and nights he forgot to sleep, and still the world didn't stop to notice. Emmett started speaking to the walls just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. Each creak of the floor felt like a question he didn't want to answer. Each morning he woke unsure if he wanted to. He carved a small heart into the tree above her grave, not because he believed in symbols, but because carving helped his hands remember they still worked. There were days he forgot to eat and nights he forgot to sleep, and still the world didn't stop to notice. He kept a box of her things under the bed but never opened it, believing memory was stronger, unopened. Emmett started speaking to the walls just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. The cold crept in like a second skin, and even firewood burned like memories, brief and painful. He stopped fixing the roof even when rain leaked in, soaking the mattress where her head used to rest. He kept a box of her things under the bed but never opened it, believing memory was stronger, unopened. Each morning brought more silence than sound, the kind that settled in the bones and stayed there. Once he tried to write her name in the dirt behind the house, but the wind took the letters before he could finish. His fingers, once strong and certain, now trembled when he held a cup, as if even tea had become too heavy. The house groaned at night like it too was grieving, floorboards sighing under the weight of ghosts and loneliness. He once found a sparrow caught in the chicken wire, and freed it gently, whispering apologies. It couldn't understand. The sky seemed wider without her but emptier too, like a roof torn off a hollow house. The house groaned at night like it too was grieving, floorboards sighing under the weight of ghosts and loneliness. He stopped fixing the roof even when rain leaked in, soaking the mattress where her head used to rest. One morning he watched a storm roll in, and didn't move to cover the windows. Let it break, he thought. Let it take what's left. He watched the road more often than he walked it, hoping for something he couldn't name. A letter arrived once. No name, no return address, just a single sentence. You still breathing? He never opened another envelope again. The sky seemed wider without her but emptier too, like a roof torn off a hollow house. Sometimes he spoke to the wind. At the livestock auction, Emmett saw her, not an animal for sale, but behind them, peeling a bruised apple. Her name was Esther. She was big, soft, wide, and didn't apologize for it. She didn't try to hide herself. People joked she was part of the stock. She had no family, no home. Later, Emmett found her behind the pen, and asked her if she was hungry. She was. He offered her a place, not the barn, but his bed. She stared at him. Folks will talk, she said. Let them, he answered. That night, she climbed into his bed, like it owed her something, and he stood by the door, unsure if he'd invited in trouble, or hope. Each morning brought more silence than sound, the kind that settled in the bones, and stayed there. He stayed because he didn't know where else to go, and he didn't leave because there was no one left to follow him. He once found a sparrow caught in the chicken wire, and freed it gently, whispering apologies it couldn't understand. People in town said he was fading, and maybe he was, bit by bit, memory by memory, like fog thinning at dawn. A letter arrived once, no name, no return address, just a single sentence. You still breathing? He never opened another envelope again. His fingers, once strong and certain, now trembled when he held a cup, as if even tea had become too heavy. He stopped fixing the roof, even when rain leaked in, soaking the mattress where her head used to rest. Some nights he sat on the porch, listening for ghosts, wondering if hers would ever speak. Sometimes he spoke to the wind, and called it by her name, just to feel foolish on purpose. There were days he forgot to eat, and nights he forgot to sleep, and still the world didn't stop to notice. One night, he lit every lamp in the house, and sat in silence, until dawn, just to see what the light might reveal. It showed only dust. Sometimes he spoke her name aloud, just to prove he hadn't forgotten how it sounded, but the name felt heavier now, like lead on his tongue. The neighbors talked, as neighbors do, but never loud enough for him to hear the whole sentence, just enough to feel it. He kept her shawl folded at the edge of the bed, untouched, smelling faintly of lavender and old summer. The sky seemed wider without her, but emptier too, like a roof torn off a hollow house. Even the dog, old and grey-faced, stopped barking, like it too had forgotten what living was for. The cold crept in like a second skin, and even firewood burned like memories, brief and painful. Once he tried to write her name in the dirt behind the house, but the wind took the letters before he could finish. He sometimes imagined her standing in the kitchen again, humming something half forgotten, stirring a pot of something warm. He carved a small heart into the tree above her grave, not because he believed in symbols, but because carving helped his hands remember they still worked. Memories clung to him like dust, settled deep, impossible to clean out, no matter how many times he scrubbed the floor. He watched the road more often than he walked it, hoping for something he couldn't name. The house groaned at night, like it too was grieving, floorboards sighing under the weight of ghosts and loneliness. And then there was Esther. She didn't act like someone who needed saving. She had strong arms and steady eyes, a woman who peeled an apple like it was a job that mattered. When she walked into his house, she didn't ask where she should go, she went where she wanted. She didn't speak much that first night, just lay with her back to him, her breath loud in the silence. He couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from the strange comfort of not being alone anymore. The bed felt too full and too empty at the same time. In the morning she boiled water, fed the fire, swept the floor like it had wronged her. When she passed him the tin cup, she didn't say a word, but her fingers brushed his, and it felt like a question. He didn't have an answer. The second night she took the same side of the bed without asking, and he found himself listening for her breath, not the silence. By the third, he missed it when she left the room. Folks in town started whispering louder. She eats more than him, one woman said. She'll crush him, said another. She'll leave like the rest. Esther didn't respond. She just stared at them with that look like a barn door left open in winter, cold still, unforgiving. She didn't try to explain herself. She didn't need to. When someone slid a corset into her hand at the store, she left it hanging on a fence post for the crow. That was the woman Empt brought home. Not delicate, not polite, real. When she laughed it sounded like wood splitting. When she walked, the floor creaked like it was learning a new language. He didn't touch her, not at first, but she noticed the moment he stopped flinching at her nearness. That tiny shift when a body accepts another. She noticed when he started setting out 2 cups instead of 1, when he started warming the quilt before she climbed into it. The snow came hard that month, thick and endless. They burned old fence rails and broken chairs. She cooked meals that filled the house with smells he hadn't known he missed. Onions, grease, bread. She cleaned the hearth with purpose, like she was cleaning a wound. He watched her from the doorway, unsure if he'd invited a stranger, or rediscovered something lost. Sometimes when she didn't know he was looking, she'd stare at the woods, that far line where the world ended. One night, she stood at the stove in her shawl and bare feet, feeding kindling to a dying fire. "You want warmth," she muttered. "You keep the fire alive." He didn't ask what she meant, but he helped stack the wood beside her. They didn't speak again that night, but something had shifted, like the house had exhaled for the first time in years. He didn't know where she came from, not really, but it didn't matter. She was here now, and suddenly the silence didn't bite so hard. She was not like the women they praised in town, thin-waisted, soft-spoken. She was not fragile. She took the space she needed, and dared anyone to take it back. He didn't know what to make of her, but he knew this: the house was warmer, the days shorter, and the bed no longer a coffin of memory. Whatever she was not temporary. She had walked into his life like she meant to stay, and though he didn't know it yet, she already had. She made bread the next morning, kneading dough with hands that knew hunger and fire, shaping it with care, sprinkling salt like it was a blessing. She cleaned the hearth like it was sacred, dusted ash from the stone like she was tending to a memory. She mended a cracked chair with wire and patience, patched the chicken coop with old tin and spit, and when a fox came for the hens, she slit its throat without flinching and buried it behind the barn. She worked like she'd been born to that house, like she already belonged to it and it to her. Emmett watched her move through the rooms like magic. No spells, no words, just the quiet insistence that she was staying. She didn't ask where things went. She simply put them where they made the most sense. And though she never smiled wide, there was a pull to her presence, like gravity had shifted and centered itself around her weight. The neighbors noticed fast. The first few came pretending to borrow things, sugar, nails, a saw, but their eyes didn't stay on Emmett. They wandered, confused, to the woman who filled the doorway like a storm. They whispered in town. Some were cruel, others just curious. But all of them talked. They said she was too loud, too strange, too big, too everything. One woman offered her a corset in town, wrapped in paper like a gift, to draw the waist in, she said with a polite cough. Esther didn't argue. She didn't yell. She left it hanging on a fence post for the crows. That was her answer. That and the bread she brought to the general store. Loaves so thick they fed families for days. Emmett began to understand something that confused him. She didn't care what they thought, not a bit. She didn't try to fit. She didn't shrink. She had been told all her life to be smaller, quieter, less, but she never learned how, and that somehow made her unstoppable. At night she pulled the quilt up over her chest and turned away, but not coldly. She wasn't asking for affection. She was offering a kind of peace, one that said, I will not hurt you, but I will not beg either. Slowly, Emmett stopped flinching when her shoulder brushed his in the dark. Slowly he started placing the kettle on the stove before she came into the room. The change was so small he barely noticed it himself. When winter came hard, with winds that sang through the cracks and snow that swallowed the fields, Esther became the fire. She chopped wood before the sun rose. She kept the coals glowing even when the wind howled through the boards. One night the stove died, and without a word, she rose from the bed, wrapped herself in a blanket, and stomped down the ladder to relight it. Emmett followed, barefoot and shivering, to find her kneeling by the embers, feeding kindling with hands that never shook. She looked up at him and said, You want warmth. You keep the fire alive, and he understood she wasn't talking just about heat. After that, he watched her differently. He started seeing the way her body moved through the house, not as too much but as just enough. She patched the leaky roof with burlap and tin. She lined the windows with old quilt. She boiled potatoes, mended socks, buried a hen that froze overnight, and still had strength left to laugh when the barn door flew open in the wind and smacked Emmett in the chest. Her laugh was jagged, like splitting wood. He liked the sound. They played cards sometimes at night. She beat him every time, and never gloated, just gave him that lopsided grin, and dealt again. The more she stayed, the more the silence retreated. The house felt less like a tomb, and more like a secret being written. But people didn't stop talking. In town, someone said she'd crush him in his sleep. Another said she ate more than she worked. One whispered that Esther must be desperate to settle with a ghost of a man. Esther never answered. Her silence was sharper than any curse. When they passed her in the street, she met their eyes and held them too long. She didn't blink, and they looked away first. Always. Sometimes Emmett thought of asking her where she came from, why her eyes scanned the woods at dusk like she was waiting for something. But he didn't. She'd tell him if she wanted to. Once he caught her staring out the window so long she didn't notice the tea had gone cold in her hand. When he asked what she was thinking, she said, just watching where the wild begins. He didn't ask again. One night, as snow blanketed the house like a warning, she made stew thick with onions and beans, and barely said a word. After they ate, she sat by the fire, and stitched a hole in his only pair of winter socks. He watched her hands work, fast and careful. She looked up once, caught him staring. You ain't used to someone staying, are you? She said. He shook his head. No, She nodded, as if that explained everything, and maybe it did. He wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point the bed no longer felt too big. It didn't creak under their silence. It held them both like it had been waiting all along. They still didn't touch, not really, but sometimes their feet found each other under the quilt. Sometimes he'd wake and find her breathing steady beside him, her body a mountain, her warmth a promise. And though no one else believed in her, he was starting to. Not just because she worked like 10 men, not just because she never flinched from the cold, but because she was still here, still fighting, still rising every day like someone who dared the world to push her down again. And Emmett, who had lived so long in the ruins of what was, began to see the shape of what could be. He didn't have the words for it yet, but he knew this. If the world was going to end again, he wanted her beside him when it did. Esther had brothers, but not the kind who protect. They were cruel, raised in hard soil, grown sharp with hunger and rage. The worst of them had once tried to sell her, said she was too much to feed and not enough to keep, tried to trade her like a sack of grain for debts and power. She'd been barely a girl then, all ribs and defiance, but even then she'd refused to cry. That night she stole a rifle, slept with it cradled to her chest like a promise. She ran at dawn and didn't look back. Years passed and she built her life on silence and survival, trusting no one until Empet. She never spoke of that part of her story, but Empet noticed how she locked the windows at night, even when the wind howled too loud for sleep. He noticed the way she stared toward the tree line, not with fear but with memory, like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. Then one morning, a message appeared nailed to the post by the back fence, carved into a scrap of barnwood, crude and jagged, a name, a threat, a slur so vile it seemed to burn in the cold air. Esther took it down without a word, fed it to the fire, and watched it curl to ash. Empet asked her who it was. "My brother," she said simply, voice flat. He looked at her, waiting. "Do you want to run?" he asked. She shook her head. "I've been running," she said. "Not anymore." She started walking the perimeter of the farm at dusk, not as a chore but a warning. She cleaned the rifle again, oiled it slow, sighted down the barrel with steady hands. Empet saw the way she scanned the woods, how her jaw tightened when the dogs barked late. When the stranger finally came, it was nearly winter. He didn't knock. He stood by the edge of the field like he belonged there, tall and hollow-eyed, beard like rust and eyes like cold ash. Esther saw him from the kitchen window and went still. "That? Him?" Empet asked. She nodded once. "I'll handle it," he said, already reaching for his coat. "No," she replied. "He came for me." She didn't take the rifle. She didn't put on boots. She walked out into the frost barefoot, apron tied tight, knife tucked into the pocket where she kept her thread and thimble. The ground crunched under her feet as she crossed the yard. Empet watched from the porch, heart pounding with something like dread, but she didn't pause. The man said something sharp, something that made her tilt her head like a wolf hearing a rustle in the dark. She didn't flinch. He stepped forward, all bluff and cruelty. That's when she moved. Fast, precise. The knife flashed once. He hit the ground like a sack of wet cement. She knelt with one knee on his throat, blade pressed against the soft edge of his eye. Her voice didn't shake. "Say it again," she hissed. "Say it now." He tried to smile. Blood bubbled from his mouth. "You think I'm scared of you?" he wheezed. "I don't care," she said, pressing harder. "You want to drag me back, sell me, break me. You should have killed me when I was small enough to carry." His laugh turned into a cough. "You ain't gonna do it." She leaned closer. "Try me." He went still then, the fight leaking out of him like steam from a cracked pot. She let him go, stood, wiped her knife on her apron, walked back to the house, like it was just another chore. Empet opened the door for her. She didn't She washed her hands in the basin, dried them on a rag, and began chopping onions for supper. Her shoulders were calm, her breathing even. Empet poured her a drink, set it on the table, and sat across from her without a word. That night, they didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't say her name or his, but when Empert reached for her hand beneath the quilt, she didn't pull away, not out of weakness or need, but because there was nothing left to fear. She had faced the thing that had haunted her steps for years, and it had left limping, coughing blood. The next morning she moved a chair to the window that faced the woods. She sat there after breakfast, rifle leaning against the wall, watching. Empert asked, once, if she thought he'd return. If he does, she said, he'll regret it, and there was no doubt in her voice, not a flicker. After that, she slept deeper, body heavier with rest. The nightmares stopped. She hummed while she stirred stew, slow and tuneless, but soft like something blooming. Empert watched her like someone watching fire, mesmerized but cautious. She was no longer just the woman who'd walked into his bed like she belonged there. She was something bigger now, something solid and unmoving. She was the storm, and the shelter, and though the neighbors still talked, they talked quieter now. One man, the same who'd called her names before, crossed the street when she came to town. Another stared too long, and she stared back, until he looked at his boots like they'd done something wrong. She wasn't afraid to be seen anymore. She walked taller, laughed louder, worked harder, and Empert, he felt something settle in his chest. Pride, maybe, or just the strange comfort of knowing the person beside him would never run again, that she would fight, bleed, bury the past, and come back to the table with dirt still under her nails, and a meal hot in the pot. That kind of strength he thought was rare. That kind of woman was rarer still, and whatever came next, he'd meet it at her side. Esther moved slower. Not in the way of someone tired, but like someone carrying something new and uncertain. Empert noticed it first in the way she rested her hand against her stomach when she thought he wasn't looking, then in the way she winced when bending too long, or how her breath came short climbing the ladder to the loft. He didn't ask, not yet. He waited until the night she gasped awake, her body tense, sweat beading on her brow despite the cold. "I think I'm not alone anymore," she whispered, voice barely touching the air. He blinked, sat up beside her. "Are you sure?" She didn't answer, only closed her eyes and nodded once. They told no one. Not the neighbors, not the preacher's wife, not the woman at the general store who always asked too many questions. Esther wrapped herself in silence and thick wool shawls, moving through her days like someone guarding a secret. But the valley around them was already whispering its own dread. A sickness had come, some kind of fever, quick and cruel. It started in the west, then crept through the fields like smoke. Folks shut their windows, bolted doors, whispered prayers into their stew pots. The school closed, the church bells rang more often, but no one stayed long after sermon. Esther kept to the farm, refusing to step beyond the fence unless she had to. Empert went into town only when absolutely necessary. He brought back flour, nails, and the sound of fear in every man's voice. "They're scared," he told her. "Good," she said. "Fear teaches." Then one grey morning in early spring, there was a knock at the door, light, but frantic. Empert moved to open it, but Esther was already there. Standing on the porch was a girl no older than 16, barefoot and shivering, blood smeared across her palm and cheek. Her eyes were wild, full of panic and hope twisted together. "Please," she gasped. "I heard you help." Esther didn't hesitate. She pulled the girl inside, wrapped her in a blanket, wiped the dirt from her face with gentle fingers. The girl burned with fever, mumbled about her parents dead or gone. She wasn't sure. The town wouldn't take her in. They said she might still carry the sickness. Esther nursed her. She boiled water, wiped sweat from the girl's skin, fed her spoonfuls of broth while Empert watched in silent worry. "You could catch it," he said one night, as Esther sat cooling a cloth by the window. "Then I catch it," she replied, not turning from the glass. "And what about the baby?" He didn't ask. She didn't answer, but the girl Maddie lived. 4 days after her arrival, the fever broke like a wave. She stood on shaky legs, smiled with cracked lips, and whispered, "I didn't think anyone would come for me." Esther just nodded. "You're here," she said. "That's enough." Maddie stayed, at first on the floor beside the hearth, then later in the loft. Once she was strong enough to climb, she helped with chores, her hands raw and blistered, but she never complained. Esther taught her to wrap her fingers with cloth, how to use her elbows to turn soil when the blisters ached. One afternoon Esther handed her the rifle. "You ever shoot?" Maddie shook her head. "You will," she said. Slowly Maddie became more than a stranger, more than a guest. She became a witness. She watched Ent's quiet kindness, watched Esther's belly grow, and the unspoken storm that built around them both. Outside the sickness returned. The town grew quieter, colder. Ent brought back rumors, fires burning near the ridge, people boarding up houses, whispers of blame and punishment. One night they saw smoke curling against the sky. "They're burning something," Ent said. Esther didn't look up from her stitching. "Someone," she corrected. The next morning, 3 men arrived at their gate, faces hidden behind handkerchiefs, eyes full of suspicion. "You took in a girl," one said. "She came from the west." Embert stepped forward. "She's clean." The tallest shook his head. "Can't risk it. We're moving folks out. She goes into quarantine. Just a few days." Maddie trembled behind the door, clutching a kitchen knife like it could change anything. Esther stood in front of them, coat tight around her belly, voice steady. "She's not going anywhere." The man laughed. "You think you can stop us?" Esther, "You come on this porch again. You better bring more than words." And there was something in her tone that made all 3 men step back. They left without another word. Embert watched her as they disappeared over the hill. "You're not scared anymore." "I was never scared," she replied. "Only quiet." Maddie cried that night, while burying one of the hens. Embert sat beside her, handing over nails for the new coop. The fever never touched the farm again, but the fear stayed like a shadow. Then in May the child kicked for the first time. Esther froze mid-step, one hand on her belly, a slow smile curling her lips. "There you are," she whispered. That night, she let Maddie press her ear to her stomach, listening for something more than heartbeat. "What do you want it to be?" Maddie asked. "A survivor," Esther said. "One who doesn't ask permission to exist." The rain came heavy that week, soaking the ground, swelling the creek, until it swallowed the lower pasture. The road washed out. They were cut off completely. Esther kept the lamps burning, stacked firewood by the door, paced the rooms like a storm waiting for landfall. Then one night, just after midnight, she felt it deep, sharp, undeniable. Her body woke her with pain, and she knew. "It's time," she whispered. Embert rose from bed, hands shaking as he lit every lamp. Maddie boiled water, tore linen into strips, prayed under her breath even though she didn't believe. The wind slammed against the shutters. Lightning flashed so close it lit the whole house in blue. Esther didn't scream. She bit down on a strip of leather, rode the pain like a wave. Hours passed. The storm raged. Her strength held. When the final moment came, she growled. Not a cry but a sound pulled from deep in her bones. Maddie caught the baby, eyes wide with shock and wonder. Embert stood behind them, silent, pale, as the child took her first breath and filled the room with sound. A daughter, broad-shouldered, lungs like thunder, hair dark and matted. Esther looked at her and nodded. "She's mine," she said, hoarsely. In every way. They named her Mercy, not for forgiveness, but because she had survived what should have broken her, because she had come through storm and fear and blood, and still found breath. The farm didn't get easier. Not after the birth. Not ever. Life didn't soften because they had survived something. The ground still cracked under the sun's weight. Crops failed. Chickens stopped laying. The well ran low. One summer, the drought stayed so long the grass turned to ash, and the wind carried dust through every window crack. Another spring, the creek swelled so high, it swallowed their fence posts, and tore the henhouse off its foundation. Emmett broke his hip during a rainstorm, crushed under a cart axle that collapsed while he tried to fix it alone. Esther found him, face in the mud, breath shallow. She lifted the cart off him herself, her knees shaking, but she didn't cry until after he was inside. The break never fully healed. He walked slower after that, one side dragging behind like a memory, but they didn't stop. Esther patched the roof with tar and rope, rebuilt the coop twice, planted cabbage even when the ground fought her. Maddie stayed too. She didn't leave after the fever passed or the child was born. She turned down every boy who asked with wide eyes and clean shirts. "I've already bled for this place," she told one, holding a shotgun. "I'm not leaving just because someone finally noticed I got pretty." She learned to shoot better than most men. She kept her knife under her pillow and her boots by the door. She worked the fields and read books, and never once called the house anything less than home. Mercy grew like a fire, fast, wild, impossible to hold. She climbed trees before she could spell her name, rode bareback through the ridge before she lost her first tooth, read everything, argued about everything. She found books in old trunks, ledgers full of long-dead names, and copied them into her own notebooks, drew maps of places she'd never see. Once she brought home the bones of a bird, and tried to reassemble it like a puzzle. When the preacher gave her a book on obedience, she tossed it into the fire, and asked if I had anything with sharper teeth. Esther never apologized for her. She was made in the dark, she said once. When someone clucked their tongue in town, you don't get something gentle from that. Mercy wasn't cruel, but she wasn't soft. When another girl at church called her strange, she smiled and said, "Better strange than scared," and the other girl didn't speak again. She carried the weight of everything they had survived, without knowing the names of half of it. And Esther, watching her daughter tear across the field with dirt on her face and a knife on her belt, smiled like someone who had buried fear long ago. The town began to change too, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Whispering turned into watching, watching turned into silence. People still stared but fewer spoke. The stories about Esther, about how she slept in the barn, about how she ate more than her share, about how she'd never last, all faded, replaced by quieter questions. A woman who had once laughed at her size now nodded when she passed. A boy who'd once thrown rocks at the fence now stepped out of her way. One afternoon an old man, one who'd once called her names sharp enough to cut, stopped her outside the grain store. He didn't say much, just looked at her, and muttered, "I was wrong." Esther stared at him, not angry, not surprised, just steady. "You are awake," she replied. That was all. That was enough. He nodded, and that was the end of it. Emmett watched the moment and didn't say anything, but later that night, he sat beside her on the porch, and handed her a cup of coffee, without a word. She sipped it and sighed. The house didn't creak under their weight anymore. It had settled around them like bark on a tree, wrapped in layers of time and noise. Maddie cleaned out the barn and turned it into a second kitchen. Mercy planted squash near the edge of the field, and carried a notebook in her back pocket, like it held the answers to everything. She asked questions no one could answer, about stars and birth and war, and whether it was possible to live a good life without being good all the time. When no one responded, she wrote her own answers. Once, during a thunderstorm, she climbed onto the roof to watch the sky. Emmett yelled for her to come down, but Esther just opened the door and said, "Let her feel it." Mercy sat up there until the clouds broke and rain soaked her hair. She came down shivering and grinning. "It doesn't scare me," she said. "Good," said Esther. "It's not supposed to." Inside, Maddie cooked stew that filled the whole house with the smell of garlic and smoke. They ate in silence, the kind that didn't feel empty. Emmett limped to the fireplace and added wood. When he sat, Mercy leaned her head against his shoulder, eyes heavy with sleep. "Will the world always be like this?" she asked. "Hard." He thought for a while, then said, "Maybe, but not always cruel." She didn't respond, just closed her eyes. That fall a young preacher tried to tell Esther her daughter needed more discipline. Said Mercy walked like a boy and talked like a sinner. Esther smiled and asked if he'd ever delivered a child in the middle of a lightning storm, with water rising past the front porch. When he didn't answer, she patted his shoulder, and told him to come back when he had something useful to say. He didn't return. The town kept watching, but from a distance. They started buying Esther's bread again, thick loaves that fed whole families, and tasted like salt and memory. They started asking Maddie for advice about hunting, and soil and weather. One woman asked Mercy to teach her son how to read. The son came back with bruises, and a new way of standing. Esther didn't ask questions, she just baked more bread. The seasons turned, slow and stubborn. Flood followed frost, followed by drought, followed by wind that ripped the barn roof clean off. Emmett sat on the porch, wrapped in quilts, unable to help rebuild. But Esther and Maddie and Mercy worked for days, their hands blistered and backs bent, laughing through the ache, and still nothing came easy. The roof leaked again, the creek flooded, coyotes took 2 hens, but the fire never died, not once. Mercy kept writing, kept riding, kept asking the world to explain itself, and every time it failed to do so, she built her own explanation, her own story. She was born from storm and silence, and a mother who carved her way through pain like it owed her passage, and the town, the one that once laughed, now whispered with respect. They didn't always understand, but they watched, and sometimes, that was enough. When Emmett died, Mercy was only 11, but she understood more than most girls twice her age. He went quietly in his sleep, one hand still wrapped around Esther's, breath fading like smoke through a cracked window. There was no scream, no rush for help, just a long silence, and then the slow creak of the bed as she stood up. Esther didn't cry at the funeral, even when the preacher said his name wrong, or when the neighbors lined the back fence in clean clothes and pity-filled eyes. She nodded politely at their words, took the pies they offered, and buried Emmett beside the sycamore tree where his first wife lay. That night, Mercy climbed into her lap and asked, "What do we do now?" Esther stroked her hair and said nothing. The tears came 2 weeks later, while chopping onions, her shoulders hunched over the cutting block, eyes overflowing not from the sting of the blade, but from everything she hadn't said. "He made room when no one else would," she whispered, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. Life didn't pause. The fields needed turning, the barn needed patching, and Mercy kept growing like a storm cloud. By 15 she carried a rifle better than most grown men, and could drop a fox before it reached the chicken run. She had fire in her eyes, and silence in her bones. She didn't ask for permission to be loud or sharp, or stubborn. She broke a boy's wrist once for calling Maddie just a stray. When the town boys whistled, she didn't blush. She stared them down until they looked away. She read every book she could find, filled pages with questions no one had answers, and carved her name into the barn wall beside the initials of people long dead. Esther watched her daughter become something fierce and strange, a force no one could hold, and loved her with a quiet so deep, it felt like gravity. One night, Mercy stood in the doorway, boots laced, pack slung over one shoulder. "I'm going," she said. "I'll come back." Esther didn't try to stop her. She only looked at her long and hard, then said, "You don't have to, just survive." That was the only blessing she gave, and so she left. The house felt different without her, not empty but unbalanced, like a song missing its last note. Maddie stayed, older now, wiser, still baking bread and feeding the fire. Esther took over Mercy's chores in silence, not because she had to but because it kept her moving. The town grew quieter again. Strangers came through sometimes, asking questions. Is this where the woman lived? The one who fought off raiders with her bare hands, who carried a horse from a ditch? They came with wide eyes and half-truths. Some said her daughter broke a man's jaw at age 10. Others swore her bread could keep you full for days. They never knew what was real, what was legend, and Esther never corrected them. She'd just nod and say, she stayed when no one else would, and that was always enough. The truth was softer, heavier. Esther had once been the woman no one wanted. Too big, too loud, too much. They said she didn't fit in the house, didn't fit in polite company, didn't fit in a world that made women small to feel safe. But she stayed. When the roof leaked, when the fields flooded, when sickness swept the valley, she stayed. She didn't run when the past came knocking. She didn't bend when the town stared. She didn't bow when they called her names. She rose, every day, She rose, with dirt under her nails, a knife on her hip, and a fire in her chest. She made the bed hers, she fed the stove, the land, the people who were brave enough to knock on her door. She didn't ask for love, but she made space for it when it came. She wasn't gentle, but she was kind. She wasn't quiet, but she listened. When winter came again, hard and thick with ice, she hummed while mending Mercy's coat, her fingers stiff but steady. She talked less those years, but when she did speak, the room listened. Maddie still called her boss, but sometimes, late at night, called her mother without realizing it. The barn stayed patched, the field gave just enough, and the fire never went out. One year, a traveler showed up with a baby on her back, looking for safety. Esther didn't ask questions. She brought her in, fed her stew and found her a place to sleep. People talk, the woman said, nervous. Let them, Esther replied. They always have. Mercy sent letters now and then, scribbled fast, ink smeared, filled with wild places and stranger names. One line stuck in Esther's mind: they don't know where I came from, but I do. And that was all she needed to read. She kept that letter under her pillow. Years passed. The wood of the porch softened with age. The orchard grew one more tree, planted by Mercy before she left. Esther's hair turned silver, then white, but her back stayed straight. When she walked into town, no one dared mock her. They nodded, stepped aside, offered her the front of the line. She never asked for it. Respect came slow, but it came. Maddie built a small shop on the side of the barn, selling preserves and firewood. Travelers came for the stories now, for the scent of bread that stuck to your clothes, for a glimpse of the woman who once made a house out of nothing. When they asked about Mercy, Esther would point to the horizon and say, "She's out there, writing her own storm." Sometimes, on cold mornings, Esther would sit by the window and hold the old rifle across her lap, not in fear, but in memory. She didn't need it anymore, she just liked the way. One evening, as the fire crackled and Maddie dozed in the chair, Esther whispered, "She wasn't born to stay, but she was born from stay." Then she closed her eyes and listened to the silence. Not empty, not sharp, just full, like the pause between heartbeats. And the truth, the real truth. It wasn't about the stories people told, or the rumors they chased. It was this: she was not built for smallness. And in a world that tried to break her, shame her, bury her, she rose, fat and feared, fierce and full, a woman made of noise and storm and weight and love. And that, more than any legend, was what mattered.